All right. So, on the eve of the presidential election of the year 2000, which you may or may not remember that year, Lyndon LaRouche wrote a paper called Politics as Art. Perhaps he could have called it Art as Politics, but it was Politics as Art, where he laid out the case that to solve the world crisis, to solve these problems, we must revive classical culture. Interesting political question. So I'd like you to take a moment and think about in your mind what you think classical culture is. Classical music, classical art. I grew up thinking that classical culture or classical music was the music of dead white European males. And I think what we're going to look at tonight is why that's, and also that it's music of a prior era. You know, music, oh, well, to be classical music, it's old music. Old music played on certain kinds of instruments. And I think what we're going to look at this evening is why that is absolutely not the case. Classical music is not from a specific period of time. It's not for a specific kind of people. So let's jump in with a quote from this wonderful paper. Okay. All right. Classical beauty is not an object at which to look in admiration, or perhaps lust. Such beauty is a relationship among persons, a relationship between the cognitive processes of the artist on the one side and the cognitive process of the audience on the other. Only in what humanity has developed as classical modes of artistry is such communication efficiently accomplished. Such art never descends to the banality of mere entertainment. It has a sacred spiritual quality, expressing a quality of the human cognitive processes by means of which they celebrate and impose that law, that each man and woman is made in the image of the creator of the universe, this universe. Here lies the superior moral authority of great classical artistic composition and its performance. With that thought in mind, let's hone in a little bit more on this question by looking at what would prevent a piece of music from being classical. A piece of music would not be classical if it didn't have a universal value for any human being. It wouldn't be classical if it didn't respect the health of the human singing voice. It wouldn't be classical if it's not classical if it does not develop, either develop musically or with something in the text. It is not classical if it doesn't choose a subject matter that's human as opposed to merely animal. And it would not be classical if it were arbitrary. We're going to take another quote from Lynn right now on that question. Okay. So Lynn wrote on this question of arbitrary, that you do something just because. He says, the point is that in art, nothing must ever be arbitrary. Never, as the romantics and so forth insist upon arbitrary, irrational whims. Whims whose claims to art are limited to the presumption that that which is utterly irrational, such as the works of Richard Wagner, is unfathomably mysterious, and therefore incredibly artistic and sexy as well. There must be governing necessity, as there is in science. That governing principle of reason must be supplied by the governing, underlying role of contrapuntal development. The contrapuntal development derived from the spark of well-tempered, thorough composition. So, why the spiritual? The African American spiritual is a specifically American form of music. Some of the rhythms draw from African rhythms, but they were songs that were developed and sung by slaves in America and passed down by word of mouth, through communities, through families, generation by generation. And if you're not familiar with the history of the slavery that was brought to the United States by the British Empire and enforced to remain here by the British Empire, it was extremely brutal. We're going to read a short discussion from one of the great arrangers of these spirituals, William Dawson, who says that removed as we are from the times and conditions which gave birth to this music, it is impossible to sense the mood expressed in their melodies and natural harmonies, or to grasp the form and content of their words without first becoming familiar with the background of their creation. They have sometimes been called sorrow songs because they reflect the cruelties suffered at the hands of masters and overseers, and the agonies and torment of soul which these cruelties produced. Two passages taken from antebellum archives will give the reader some idea of what American slavery meant to the black man, introduced here to give vividness and authenticity to this analysis of the meaning of religious folk music of the Negro, popularly called spirituals. So yeah, we're just going into a little background on this for those who aren't familiar with some of the history of the spirituals. Okay, so this quote is taken from an actual act of the legislature of South Carolina in 1741. Which was apparently intended to put a curb on the torturing of slaves. Quote, "In case any person shall willfully cut out the tongue, put out the eye, castrate, or cruelly scald, burn, or deprive any slave of any limb or member, or shall inflict any other cruel punishment, other than by whipping or beating with a horsewhip, cowskin, switch, or small stick, or by putting irons on, or confining or imprisoning such slave, every such person shall, for every such offense, forfeit the sum of 100 pounds current money." So I guess you can pay for your sins. Today we I'll save that comment maybe for Q&A, but so you can pay, you get a fine if you cut off someone's arm as a punishment. So the second passage is actually sounds like it's someone who actually opposes what's being done with the slaves, but he gives this discussion that indicates what he sees is going on. It's taken from an address by Henry Berry before the House of Delegates of Virginia in 1832. He says, "Pass as severe laws as you will to keep these unfortunate creatures in ignorance, it is in vain, unless you can extinguish the spark of intellect which God has given them. Let any man who advocates slavery examine the system of laws that we have adopted toward these creatures, and he may shed a tear upon that. And would to God, sir, the memory of it might thus be blotted out forever. Sir, we have as far as possible closed every avenue by which light might enter their minds. We have only to go one step further to extinguish the capacity to see the light, and our work would be completed. They would then be reduced to the level of the beast of the field, and we should be safe. And I am not certain that we would not do it if we could find out the necessary process." So here Dawson continues, "These excerpts give deep and poignant meaning to the words of the spiritual familiar to most Americans. Nobody knows the trouble I see. With such a background, we marvel at the lack of a single word of hate in the religious folk songs of the Negro. In the midst of inhumanity, he sang, 'Lord, I want to be a Christian. I want to be like Jesus.' In these songs, one can hear the cry for deliverance and freedom which lurks behind every measure, because the Negro literally poured his heart into them." So the songs, that referred to one song, "Nobody Knows the Trouble I See." These songs, this music that came out of slavery, or more accurately, in spite of slavery, began by the 1880s, 1890s to actually become concert music sung for concert audiences, and began to be written down and arranged and developed. And this is what began to be developed into a unique classical art form. So, presuming I can get the quote up, third time's the charm, we're going to read a bit more from Lyndon LaRouche on exactly this. Okay. All right. So he's been discussing classical tragedy, classical art. He says, "Classical composition so defined includes the greatest works in classical sculpture and classical Renaissance painting, such as that of Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael Sanzio, and Rembrandt. It includes all of the greatest classical poetry and drama. It includes all great musical compositions, which are either classical from the outset or rendered fully expressive of classical principles of composition by aid of the kind of polish supplied to the Negro spiritual by the collaboration of Antonin Dvorak and Harry Burleigh, and by the continuation of that process of perfection by the great classical artist Roland Hayes and his collaborators and followers. That latter choice of example the case of the Negro spiritual, has special importance for all among our people, of African descent or not, who are oppressed by the sense that life has reduced the common folk to the treatment intended for underdogs, or people degraded even to the social status of virtual human cattle. If you once come to know the way in which the classical principle of composition is expressed in such an excellent and profound way by those spirituals, you should recall that these originated as works of art, composed by and shared among successive generations of cruelly oppressed slaves who were each at least partially of African descent. The power of these compositions, which Dvorak, Burleigh, Hayes, and others have honed to a state of relative perfection, expressed among those slaves the same genius inherent in all human beings. Those spirituals so honed have a special power for all on that account. They should inspire us to recognize that there is no oppression so efficient that it can obliterate the fact of the noble quality of humanity, as man and woman made in the image of the Creator, a quality innate to each newborn child. So we're going to take a few examples, beginning with Roland Hayes, who Lynn referenced. Roland Hayes was a remarkable person. He lived from 1887 to 1977. Ooh, long lifespan. And he grew up in a rural Negro settlement, or settlement of African American people in Georgia. Very farm-like. Education didn't go beyond 7th grade typically. And he was surrounded by music. Just one little brief quote that I like from his autobiography. "When I was a child, I drank in all the music I heard, in the woods and fields, at church and singing school, in our cabin and at the feet of my father. And so all of my life," there was a bit more, "and so all of my life was music until my father died." So he was surrounded by music. The significance of his father dying is he had to go to work. But then there's this remarkable point where he goes to work in a foundry, and I find this to be a very American story. He's a petite guy, petite young guy, and he's working in this back-breaking situation, and he discovered a newer, better formula for the core, for blending the cores in the foundry process. He discovered this new formula, at which point he was given a massive raise, hired 2 people to help do his work, so that he would work in the morning and then go to school in the afternoon. So I just think that's a delightful story. Let's jump into hearing him sing. This is an actual recording from probably 1922, and as Lynn talked about how Hayes was one of the people who developed these spirituals, this arrangement, and what I mean by arrangement is the particular, beginning to conclusion, the melody and the piano part, was put together by Hayes himself. Oh, here. There's a picture of him obviously later in life, but at a piano. Okay, so let's hear him sing. The song is Go Down Moses. And the picture is obviously younger. Okay, Go Down Moses. Okay, so clearly a dead white European male. All right, let's take another example here. The composition is excuse me. This is an arrangement, an arrangement by Harry T. Burleigh. That's a picture of him younger, who lived from 1866 through 1949. And his grandfather actually bought his freedom from slavery in 1835 and eventually made it to Erie, Pennsylvania, where Harry was born and raised, with a huge amount of music around him, and most especially the spirituals, which his grandfather would sing to him as they went around. One of his grandfather's jobs was to light the street lights, and he would sing the spirituals while this was going with his grandson. When Burleigh came to New York, for us New Yorkers, this is a New Yorker. When Burleigh came to New York to study at what we used to have, the National Conservatory of Music, he met the famous composer Dvorak, and Dvorak heard him singing the spirituals and really cathected to that, I can say a little more on that in the Q&A or in the discussion if you want. But in brief, Dvorak, having heard these songs from Harry, from Burleigh, said, "In the Negro melodies of America, I discover all that is needed for a great and noble school of music." It goes on. "They are pathetic, tender, passionate, melancholy, solemn, religious, bold, merry, gay, or what you will. It is a music that suits itself to any mood or purpose. There is nothing in the whole range of composition that cannot be supplied with themes from this source. The American musician understands these tunes, and they move sentiment in him." So I would echo Dvorak saying, if you are an American, not just an American musician, if you are an American, you must know these spirituals. So he's the arranger of it. We're going to watch a performance by a long-term collaborator of the Schiller Institute named William Warfield, who was a professional singer. Fantastic one. And I would encourage people to listen to everything you can find of him. And in fact, there's a beautiful recording of him singing this exact song about probably 40 years earlier than the version we're going to listen to. We're going to listen to one from, actually I'm not sure what year it's from, somewhere in the 90s at a Schiller Institute event where he's accompanied by another good collaborator of ours, Sylvia Olden Lee. Here we go. And this song it's called Deep River, and you'll totally understand the words and the idea from his performance of it. I'll just say one teeny note historically when he's talking about crossing over the river. It's the river, there's a biblical reference to the river of Jordan that the Israelites had to cross over to get to freedom. So there's additional meanings, but I just wanted to share that before we watch this.
I was a boy soprano, and when my voice changed, my father put me out of the choir. He was the pastor of our church. My father was. And in the meanwhile, I took up piano, and that became my first love. And long about when I was about 16 years old, in a music class, the music teacher said to me, "Sing this next phrase, Bill." And I sang. She said, "You have a lovely voice, and I think you ought to try to sing. Would you like to come and take voice lessons?" And her name was Miss Miller, and I said yes. And so the end result was that I was asked to sing in an assembly program. And the thing that I chose, which I knew the most, having come out of a religious background, was the arrangement of Harry T. Burleigh's Deep River. And I still like to sing that, and it's very reminiscent of me when I was 16 years old. And it's been with me a long time, as I will be 80 next January. cross over into campground. Oh, don't you want to go to that gospel feast, that promised land, where all is peace? Oh, deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into
Okay, and we've been a little male heavy. We'll take, let's get some, it's definitely not all music of dead white, because we've got some living and some not white. Males. Okay, males. So we're going to listen to a spiritual by, okay, Evelyn LaRue Pittman. She lived in the 1910 to 1992, and we're just going to jump right into this arrangement that she did of a spiritual called Anyhow, which could be some of the words in it, 'cause I'm on my way to heaven anyhow, or despite everything else, I'm on my way to heaven. And this will be conducted by another woman, Diane Sayre of the Schiller Institute Chorus. Diane is one of the presenters on this Saturday's opening panel. So this is the Schiller Institute Chorus.